just don't wanna be lonely. Well, she's a wolf in sheep's clothing. I never needed anyone like this before. Oh, yeah. Oh, love's like a drug for me. Oh, love's like a drug for me.
So already you can see the first stage of change there, and that is considered a cover. But then the kick drums approached me and said, "We want you to do a remix." So at this point in time, this was a few years ago, there were certain influences that I was listening to, and now we're going to start getting into a little bit more gritty type electronic music. But these are just some of and these are kind of more popular groups at the time that I was kind of listening to. This really influenced where I wanted to go with my remix. So let's listen to Soulwax, Crack the Night version. And this is actually a remix of themselves. So Soulwax is a band, but then they also DJ under a different alias, but they often will remix their own songs from the band version to more of a nightclub version, or as you can see, the N-I-T-E, night version that they use. So let's listen to the Soulwax. You'll hear the other examples, but this was really kind of getting me into kind of a really gritty, more distorted, and kind of real bendy synths type of sound. And then Justice is a much bigger electronic music group. They actually won a Grammy for the album that this song is on. But you'll hear here that they take kind of that similar vibe of really distorted and grungy sound, and they push it even harder. You're also going to hear a lot of elements cutting in and out, and you'll hear electric bass being sampled and cut in and out. So let's listen to Justice Phantom Part 2. So that's kind of it's a little bit harder, much more distorted type music, but that's kind of the stuff that I was interested in at the time. And then I'll play one last example here. This is more of what we're going to talk about soon, considered a breakbeat remix. And I really like the use of the drums in this, and also kind of the power and the changes in texture, particularly with how the edits are on the drums. So let's give that one a listen. So lots of little edits in there and lots of focuses on kind of the beat and obviously the bass line. And that's something that I really wanted to mention as I'm about to talk about my goals, is that these are all very bass line focused. So with those influences in mind, I wanted to approach this remix with a few certain goals. The first was I really wanted to take this, kind of the original vibe of the original. There's definitely some rock and funk coming from that 1975 version. And then the kick drums kind of made it a little bit more pop, a little bit more dancey. So I really wanted to combine those ideas, but then also really focus more on the bass line instead of just the vocals. I really wanted to have also gritty, distorted synths, kind of like we heard in the Soulwax and Justice examples. I wanted to do a lot of intense sound design particularly Love is a Drug, you know. I kind of wanted it to make it seem a little weird at moments. And then finally, I wanted to have the remix fit into the breakbeat genre, which we're going to talk about now. So a little history on breakbeat, or more commonly, at least to me, referred to as breaks music. What is a breakbeat? Well, originally, kind of in this same time period that Roxy Music made this, and back into the 60s, early funk and soul would have a song that played, and then in the middle, they would have a break where all the instruments took the break except for the drummer, and the drummer took a solo. And this is still common in jazz today, to have a drum solo on certain songs. And what happened, those were recorded onto records and released, and what happened is some of the real pioneers in turntablism and sampling via turntables would take those moments in a funk or a soul record, and they would sample them. Excuse me. In other words, they'd be playing one break beat. This is the actual beat from the jazz drummer or the soul drummer that was playing during that break. And then he would play it on one record, and then he would loop it again on the second record. And then he could sample back and forth. And the reason they did that was people really liked to dance to those break beats. That was the impetus for those DJs to start doing that. And by extending the break during the song, then people really went crazy, they found, on the dance floor. And then what happened after the invention of the sampler, which is a machine that can record any kind of music or audio and then play it back in different ways, or it can be edited and cut up. This was kind of came about in the 1980s. Well, hip-hop really decided to start sampling breakbeats, or breaks as I'm going to call them from now on, to create the beat for the song. And there's a lot of good examples of this on a certain video. If you want to write that down, I don't know if anyone has heard about the Amen break, but it's one of the most popular break beats. There's a really great video that kind of really shows this particular break beat has been played in hundreds of songs. And it's just been used over and over from hip hop, and then in the 90s, particularly in the UK, jungle and drum and bass really exploded in the United Kingdom in the 90s, which is a much faster paced electronic music. And then eventually towards the mid and the late 90s, actually what became called just breaks, which was dance music only focused around the break beat, usually at considered a dance tempo, like around anywhere from 128 to 135. And that breaks, that was kind of the ultimate arriving of the genre that I really tend to work in now, breakbeat music, which is considered electronic dance music tempo, and also really uses a lot of breakbeat. Now, that came a lot further to where people started adding one-shots, and eventually they stopped sampling the original breakbeats from the 60s and the 70s. But I really like to hold true to that tradition of sampling from an old break. So let's hear this. This is called the Amen break. It's from the Winstons' Amen Brother, 1969. This is a very famous break that's used a lot. So I'm just curious if I could get a show of hands. Who has heard that break used before? Look around you. Almost everybody has their hand raised. So pretty interesting. And again, if you watch that video, it's kind of an eye-opener if you haven't seen it. Really interesting to see how that break in the middle of the song, Amen Brother, became used over and over, and it's still used constantly today, used in commercials and films, everything that you can imagine. It's even kind of become part of the dance music culture. Okay, so now I'm going to be kind of taking you through the actual making of my remix. Now you know my influences and my goals, so this is kind of how we're going to roll through this. I'm just going to get going here. We've got a lot of samples to listen to. So again, we just talked about breakbeat music and how it was used. Well, now I'm going to show you how I treated the drums. So the first thing was I wanted to take the original material, but then I also, because this was commissioned as a creative remix, I wanted to use quite a bit of my own new material. So one of the first things that I did was I sampled a breakbeat. So let's listen to the break. This one's a very short loop. Very, very short little loop. And then I kind of want to take you into the processing I did to get my final result on the drums. And this may seem like a lot of steps. There's actually a lot more steps than you're seeing here. I'm kind of combining some of them together. But the first thing as I did is I took that loop and then I cut it. So you can hear all the individual hits there. And then I edited them together and synced it to the new tempo that I was using for the song. And I also rearranged the hits, right? It doesn't have to play in the same order that it was in the original. So let's hear the edited version now. Right? So the hits have been moved around and now it's synced to the tempo I wanted to use for the song. And then the next thing I did was I did one round of gate, compression, and a little bit of EQ on this sample that we're going to hear. Let's hear that. And what I was doing for that is I was really trying to isolate the hi-hats more out of that break. So I EQ'd it another step further so really you can mostly hear the hi-hats. And then I took that and I doubled it again and moved some parts around even more, and I EQ'd one of the breaks for the hi-hat, then another for the snare, and another for the kick. So that's the separate example. Start to sound more like the actual final product. I added what are called one-shot samples, meaning it's just a single kick and a single snare that I layered on top. And these samples that I picked are much bigger, slightly over-compressed, which is kind of part of the sound. You're going to hear a lot of over-compression in this song. But it really all of a sudden beefs up that drum loop. So let's hear the one-shot samples. Other one-shot samples, so where I would take out the hi-hat and I'll put in a ride, and I'll kind of vary those rides to make it sound like a real drummer. That was one of my bigger goals here. I always made sure that, drummers only got two hands, so he was only hitting two at once, and I always have the hat panned a little bit to the right. I was real specific that I wanted my drums to sound more like a drummer than a lot of dance music. Now I realize this doesn't sound exactly like a drummer because it's very quantized. But the techniques I was using, I was trying to imitate kind of more of a real drummer sound. And then the next thing I did was I recorded electric bass myself. So what you're going to hear here is already cut up because I had to edit some of the takes together. And it's not the cleanest, but let's give a listen to my bass recording.